The afternoon sun hung low over the hills of Israel. Golden light spilled across the earth, painting the soil with warmth and dust. In the middle of that endless field, a young man worked behind 12 oxen, pushing a wooden plow through the ground. His name was Elisha. Strong hands, steady rhythm. A man faithful to his daily work, unaware that this would be the last day he'd ever touch that plow again. Each pull of the oxen echoed through the quiet air. The dry wind brushed his face, carrying the scent of the harvest and the sound of creation at rest. Everything seemed ordinary, but heaven was already preparing to interrupt his routine, because God often calls people in the middle of what feels like normal. Far beyond the horizon, through waves of heat, a figure approached slowly. An older man, wrapped in a dark mantle, his steps heavy with purpose. His eyes carried fire and stillness, the mark of one who had seen both kings and angels. It was Elijah, the prophet of God, the man who once stood alone before hundreds of false prophets, the man who had called down fire from heaven and watched it consume stone and water alike. Now that same prophet walked through the dust toward Elisha. He didn't shout, he didn't explain, he didn't need to. Because when God is about to change your life, he doesn't always give you a warning. Elisha kept working, unaware of who was behind him. Then, suddenly, he felt something heavy touch his shoulders. He turned and saw Elijah standing there, silent, his eyes fixed on him. The prophet's mantle, the symbol of divine authority, now rested upon Elisha. The fabric shimmered faintly under the sunlight, glowing like fire hidden in cloth. The air itself grew still. Even the oxen stopped. For a brief moment it felt as if time had paused, heaven holding its breath. Elisha's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the mantle, but even more, he could feel the weight of the call. He didn't fully understand, but he knew his life had just changed. Elijah didn't say a single word. He simply turned and began to walk away. That's how destiny often arrives, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. It just happens. Elisha stood there, torn between the world he knew and the world he was suddenly called into. He ran after the prophet and cried out, "Wait, let me say goodbye to my family." Elijah turned halfway, his voice calm but sharp. "Go," he said, "but remember what I have done to you." Those words sank deep into Elisha's heart. He watched as Elijah walked away again, his figure slowly swallowed by the light of the sun. And there, standing alone in the field, Elisha looked down at the oxen, the plow, the tools, the sweat, the life he had always known. He knew what he had to do. He gathered the wood from his plow and built a fire. The flames climbed high, their light dancing against the golden horizon. He sacrificed the oxen and used their yokes for fuel. Smoke filled the air, thick and fragrant, rising like a prayer. Neighbors came running, confused. But Elisha didn't waver. He wasn't destroying his work. He was burning his way back to God. That fire was not about loss, it was about surrender. It was Elisha's declaration that there was no turning back. He would not keep a bridge to his past life. He would not leave a path of return. When God calls, obedience often looks like fire. And as the last embers faded, Elisha looked around one final time. The field was quiet. The animals were gone. The plow was gone. The life he once knew had turned to ash. But his heart burned with something new, a sacred resolve. He began to walk. The dust rose around his feet as he followed the invisible path of the prophet. He didn't carry gold. He didn't carry plans. He only carried faith. Faith that the same God who called Elijah was now calling him. From that day on, Elisha never looked back. He walked into the unknown, to serve, to learn, to grow in silence. He would become the shadow of Elijah, the student who would one day carry double the power of his teacher. Because the fire that fell from heaven on Mount Carmel had not ended there. It had found a new vessel. The man who once plowed fields would now plow nations. The hands that once guided oxen would now command miracles, and the field that burned behind him became the altar where his destiny began. That day, Elisha learned that the call of God doesn't start with glory. It starts with surrender. And when you let go of what's familiar, God multiplies what's eternal. The plowman had become a prophet, and the story of multiplication had just begun. The sun had barely risen over the quiet hills when the sound of weeping broke the morning stillness. In a small house at the edge of the village, a woman sat alone, her hands trembling as she held a small clay jar of oil. Her husband, once a servant of the prophet, was dead, and now the creditors had come to take her 2 sons as slaves. The air inside her home felt heavy, filled with the weight of fear and helplessness. Her eyes wandered across the room, the empty shelves, the cracked floor, the silence that seemed to swallow every breath. Outside, life went on. People bought and sold grain, children laughed, and merchants shouted their prices. But inside, time had stopped. The woman's world had shrunk to one desperate question. What do I have left? When she heard the familiar footsteps outside her door, her heart lifted for the first time in days. It was Elisha, the prophet of God, the same man who once walked behind Elijah through fire and storm. He stood at her door, calm and steady, his presence carrying a quiet authority. The woman fell to her knees and cried, "My husband, your servant, is dead. You know he feared the Lord, but now the creditor has come to take my 2 boys." Elisha looked at her with compassion. He didn't see a poor widow. He saw a vessel waiting to be filled. "What do you have in your house?" he asked gently. She wiped her tears and answered, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a little oil." Elisha's eyes softened, but his tone carried faith. "Then that is enough," he said. "Go and borrow empty jars from all your neighbors. Don't gather just a few. Gather many. Then go inside, close the door behind you and your sons, and begin to pour the oil into all the jars." The woman looked confused. Her jar was small, barely enough to fill 1 cup, let alone many vessels. But she remembered her husband's faith, and something in the prophet's voice told her this wasn't madness. It was a miracle in motion. So she obeyed. Her sons ran through the streets, knocking on doors, collecting every jar, every bowl, every container they could find. When they returned, their arms were full and their faces bright with a spark of hope. The woman closed the door. The world outside disappeared. Only faith remained. She looked at the small jar in her hands. It seemed so insignificant, yet she lifted it carefully, tilted it over the first vessel, and began to pour. At first a few drops, then a stream, then a flow. The oil did not stop. It filled the first jar, then the second, then the third. The room echoed with the sound of oil touching clay, a soft rhythm of heaven at work. Her sons watched in awe. Every jar that had been empty now overflowed. When she called for another, one son whispered, "There are no more." And instantly, the oil stopped. Not one drop wasted. Not one vessel left unfilled. The woman stood in silence, surrounded by jars of oil that shimmered in the dim light. Her tears fell, but this time they were not of sorrow. They were of awe. She touched one of the jars, her fingers trembling. It was real. Every vessel was full. The God who once sent fire through Elijah had now sent provision through Elisha. Her sons began to laugh, their voices echoing against the clay walls. The sound of joy returned to that house for the first time in years. She opened the door and sunlight flooded in, turning the jars into mirrors of gold. The oil reflected light like a living flame, a symbol of God's endless supply. The woman ran to find Elisha. When she reached him, her heart was pounding. She fell before him and said, "The jars are full, every one of them." Elisha smiled gently and replied, "Go, sell the oil, pay your debts, and live on what remains." Those words were more than instructions. They were a promise. She would not just survive, she would live. The same oil that once symbolized her lack now became the source of her freedom. The same hands that trembled in fear were now lifted in gratitude. As she walked home, her heart burned with understanding. The miracle was never about the oil itself. It was about obedience. God didn't multiply what she wished for. He multiplied what she was willing to use. Faith had turned scarcity into abundance. And that lesson would stay with her forever. The flow doesn't start when you wait. It starts when you pour. Inside her home, the light of the afternoon touched the jars once more. The smell of oil lingered like incense. The laughter of her sons filled the air. And somewhere beyond the village, Elisha walked quietly, his mantle moving with the wind. He didn't need to see the result. He knew that the same God who multiplied the oil would soon multiply something else, faith in the hearts of those who believed. Because miracles don't just fill jars, they fill souls. And the God who provided for that widow still pours out today, as long as there is an empty vessel willing to be filled. The famine had returned to the land. The ground was dry, the trees bare, and hunger echoed through every valley. Even the sons of the prophets, those who served and studied under Elisha, felt the weight of lack pressing against them. They lived by faith, yet their faith was being tested. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Elisha looked upon the weary faces gathered around him. Their robes were worn, their hands thin, but their hearts still burned with devotion. He stood and said, "Prepare a large pot and cook a stew for the men." The order sounded simple, but in times of famine, even simple things become miracles. A young disciple hurried out into the wild fields to find whatever he could. He searched through dry bushes and thorny vines until his eyes caught sight of something green. Wild gourds growing across a tangle of roots. They looked fresh, vibrant, full of promise. Without knowing what they were, he gathered them eagerly into his cloak and ran back to camp. The fire crackled, the great pot hung over the flames. The disciples cut the herbs, the wild plants, and the mysterious gourds into pieces and tossed them into the boiling water. The smell was strong, sharp, unfamiliar, but in their hunger it seemed good. When the stew was ready, they filled their bowls and began to eat. But moments later, the sound of coughing and shouting broke the calm. One of them cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." Fear spread like the poison itself. The stew that was supposed to sustain them had turned into something deadly. Bowls were dropped, spoons clattered, and panic filled the air. Some had already tasted it and felt the bitterness burning their tongues. In their eyes, this was the end. But Elisha remained calm. His face did not show fear, only faith. He looked at the pot and said simply, "Bring me some flour." A disciple ran to fetch it. Elisha took the flour in his hand, ordinary, simple flour, and threw it into the pot. Then he said, "Serve it to the people, that they may eat." The men hesitated. The same pot that had brought death was now supposed to bring life. But they obeyed. They dipped their bowls once more. They tasted it again, and to their astonishment, the bitterness was gone. The poison had vanished. The stew was clean, rich, and safe. What moments ago carried death now carried nourishment. The silence that followed was sacred. Every eye turned to Elisha, the prophet who had once made oil flow without end, and now had turned poison into food. But he knew it wasn't his power. It was a reflection of the God who redeems. As the men ate, peace returned to the camp. The fear lifted, and in its place, gratitude filled the air. The fire flickered softly, casting light on their faces, faces that had just seen death transformed into life. Later that night, when the others slept, Elisha sat alone beside the dying fire. The stars stretched endlessly above him. He looked at the pot still hanging over the coals, and he understood the message hidden inside the miracle. It wasn't just about food. It was about the heart. The poison in the pot was a reflection of the poison that can live within people, unseen, unrecognized, slowly spreading until it destroys peace and joy. Bitterness, jealousy, fear, resentment. They all look harmless at first, just like those wild gourds. They seem natural, even appealing. But when mixed into the soul, they turn the spirit bitter. And just as Elisha threw flour into the pot, God throws grace into the human heart. The flour didn't just neutralize the poison, it transformed the entire meal. That is what grace does. It doesn't discard the vessel, it redeems it. It doesn't destroy the contaminated, it restores them. God doesn't always remove the pot. He changes what's inside it. He doesn't throw away the heart, he cleanses it from within. The same person who once carried pain can become a vessel of healing. The same voice that once spoke bitterness can now speak peace. The same life that once carried shame can now carry testimony. Elisha's act was more than a miracle. It was a prophecy. It pointed to a greater healer, one who would come centuries later and turn death itself into life. Jesus would become the flour for all humanity, the bread of heaven who purifies every heart, willing to receive him. In him, the poison of sin loses its power. In him, what was once bitter becomes sweet again. When dawn broke, the men awoke refreshed, their strength renewed. The famine still existed outside the camp, but within those walls there was life. They learned that survival is not about what you have, it's about who you trust. Faith had once again fed them, not only through food, but through revelation. Before they moved on, Elisha looked at them and said quietly, "Remember this night. Remember that what seems deadly can still be redeemed." The disciples nodded, understanding more than his words. They understood the heart behind them. They gathered their things, and the prophet led them forward toward the next city. Behind them, the empty pot still hung over the ashes, a silent witness to grace. And every time the wind passed through the camp, it carried a faint scent of what once was poison, now turned into provision. The land was still dry, the famine still cruel. Every field was dust, every harvest long gone. But in the middle of hunger, faith still breathed, faint but alive. Elisha sat outside the camp, his mantle resting beside him, watching the horizon turn gold as the sun descended. Around him, the sons of the prophets, 100 men in total, gathered quietly, their faces thin and tired. They had followed him through drought, through darkness, through days of silence. They were men of faith, but even faith feels the ache of an empty stomach. As the wind moved through the dry air, a man approached from the nearby town of Baal-Shalisha. He carried a small bag slung over his shoulder. Inside it, 20 barley loaves and a few ears of grain, a humble gift, almost nothing compared to the need around him. He bowed before Elisha and said, "This is the first fruits of my field, brought to the man of God." Elisha looked at the gift, then at the crowd of hungry faces. He didn't see scarcity, he saw opportunity. He turned to his servant and said, "Give it to the people that they may eat." The servant hesitated. "Master," he said softly, "how can I set this before 100 men?" His question was honest. The math didn't make sense. 20 small loaves against 100 empty mouths. But Elisha's eyes didn't waver. He spoke again, his voice steady and full of quiet authority. "Give it to the people," he repeated, "for this is what the Lord says. They will eat, and there will be leftovers." There was a moment of silence. Then, obedience. The servant began to distribute the bread. At first, Carefully, one loaf here, half a loaf there, but as he reached the end of the basket, something miraculous began to happen. The bread didn't run out. No matter how much he gave, there was always more. Each time his hand returned to the basket, it was full again. The men began to eat, slowly at first, then with joy, then with laughter. The sound of breaking bread filled the air, mingled with the crackle of the fire and the sighs of relief. Elisha watched silently, his heart at peace. He didn't celebrate. He understood. Miracles were never about spectacle. They were about faith meeting obedience. When the meal was over, the servant came back holding a basket full of leftovers. Elisha smiled. God had not only met the need, he had exceeded it. Because heaven doesn't count like man counts. As the fire dimmed and the men leaned back, full for the first time in weeks, Elisha sat quietly and watched the flames flicker. The smell of bread still hung in the air. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, silent and vast. He thought of the God he served, the same God who multiplied oil for a widow, purified poison from a pot, and now had filled an empty camp with bread. Each miracle had carried a lesson. The oil had taught them faith, the flour had taught them grace, and the bread taught them generosity. Because the miracle had not started when Elisha prayed. It started when the man shared. He could have kept his first fruits for himself. He could have eaten them quietly, pretending not to notice the hunger around him. But instead, he chose to give, and that act of surrender opened the door for the impossible. God doesn't multiply what we hide, he multiplies what we give. The blessing doesn't begin in the basket, it begins in the heart. Elisha rose and walked among the men. Some were already asleep, their faces peaceful under the moonlight. He looked at them, prophets in training, men who had chosen faith over comfort, and he smiled. They had seen with their own eyes that the God of heaven cares for both soul and stomach. He provides for every part of life, big and small. The servant approached, still holding the basket of leftovers. He said softly, "Master, there's more than before we started." Elisha placed his hand over the basket and whispered, "That's how grace works." Then he turned his eyes to the stars. He could almost hear the echo of another day, far in the future, when another prophet would stand before a crowd of thousands, breaking bread and feeding them all with more left over than when he began. It was the same heart, the same power, the same God, simply revealed in greater measure. Elisha understood that every miracle on earth points to something eternal. The oil pointed to the Spirit that never runs dry. The flour pointed to the word that purifies. And the bread pointed to the Messiah, the bread of life, who would one day satisfy every hungry soul. The prophet turned back toward the camp, his robe brushing against the sand. The fire crackled softly behind him. The men slept in peace. The basket sat beside the flames, overflowing. And as the wind carried the scent of bread across the night, Elisha whispered to himself, "The God who multiplies never stops." He walked into the shadows, his figure fading into the desert's golden dust, the servant of a limitless God, leaving behind the quiet testimony of abundance. The night had fallen quiet over the prophet's camp. The last fire burned low, its glow flickering across the empty jars, the worn pot, and the basket still half full of bread. Each object whispered of a miracle. But Elisha sat alone, his eyes lifted to the stars, and he knew every sign, every wonder, every gift was pointing to something deeper. He thought of the widow and her oil, how faith began to flow when she poured. He remembered the bitter stew, how a single handful of flour turned death into life. He smiled as he recalled the bread, multiplied until everyone was filled. Different miracles, same message. God doesn't just change circumstances, he changes hearts. That night, the desert wind carried the sound of peace. The famine had not yet ended, but inside Elisha's spirit there was no lack. He understood now that the greatest multiplication was not in jars or loaves, but in the soul that trusts. When a person believes, hope multiplies. When a person obeys, peace multiplies. When a person gives, love multiplies. The God of heaven was teaching his prophet that miracles are not rewards for faith. They are revelations of his nature. He multiplies because that is who he is. Elisha stood and looked out into the darkness. The men who followed him were sleeping, their faces lit by the soft glow of dying embers. He whispered, "They think they've seen everything. But the greatest work is happening inside them." He walked past the jars, touched the old pot, and smiled. Each of these moments was a reflection of what God does in the unseen, filling the empty, purifying the broken, feeding the hungry. The lesson was not about oil or flour or bread. It was about trust. It was about letting God touch the places of lack and transform them into abundance. Every miracle begins the same way, with emptiness. An empty jar, an empty heart, an empty table. God always starts with what's missing because emptiness is an invitation for his presence. Elisha knelt beside the fire and prayed softly, "Lord, teach me to see beyond the signs. Let me understand your heart." The wind rose gently, lifting the corner of his mantle as if heaven itself was answering. And in that quiet moment, Elisha felt something shift within him. The peace that comes when you stop asking for more and start realizing you already have enough. He remembered the day Elijah's mantle fell from the sky, burning with divine fire. He remembered striking the river and watching the waters part, and he realized all along God had not been multiplying things around him. He had been multiplying the prophet within him. When dawn began to rise, Elisha stood at the edge of the camp. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, glowing with the soft light of a new day. Behind him lay every miracle, every moment of grace. But ahead of him was something greater: purpose. He knew now that the real miracle was not the oil, the flour, or the bread. It was the transformation of the human heart, the ability to believe again, to hope again, to give again. Each sign had been a shadow of a greater truth, that God multiplies what is surrendered to him. The widow's oil showed that faith must be poured out. The poisoned stew revealed that grace can heal what seems ruined. The multiplied bread proved that generosity unlocks heaven, and together they told the story of a God who turns emptiness into overflow. Elisha took a deep breath. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face and whispered, "The God who multiplies has multiplied me." He understood that the miracles around him were the same miracles now within him. He had become the vessel, the pot, and the bread. Everything he touched from that moment on would carry life. As the sun climbed higher, he lifted his hands and prayed aloud, "Lord of heaven, you are the God who multiplies faith in the hearts of those who believe. You fill what is empty, you heal what is poisoned, and you bless what is shared. Teach us to trust you in our famine, to obey you in our weakness, and to pour out even when we feel small. Make us vessels of your spirit, carriers of your light. Let every broken life become a story of restoration, and let the world see through us that your grace never runs dry." He lowered his hands and stood in silence. The morning wind swept through the valley, lifting the dust like golden smoke. The world felt still, as if heaven had drawn close to listen. The prophet turned back toward the camp. The men were waking, stretching, gathering their things. He smiled at them, not as a teacher but as a brother. They didn't yet know it, but they were about to carry this same power into the world, the power to believe when nothing makes sense, the power to trust when the jar looks empty. Elisha lifted his staff and began to walk. Each step felt lighter than the last. The same God who had fed 100 men with a handful of bread was now feeding his soul with endless peace. The famine outside no longer mattered, because abundance was alive within him. As the prophet disappeared into the horizon, the voice of the Spirit seemed to whisper through the wind. The greatest multiplication is not in what you hold, but in who you become. And with that, the story of the prophet of multiplication came full circle, from the fire in the field to the fire within. Elisha had learned the final truth, that when a person truly surrenders to God, the miracle never stops, because the miracle has become them. The screen fades to light. The sound of wind and soft fire lingers, and a gentle voice closes the story. If this message touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like the widow's oil, let it pour forward. Share this word, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and help this story reach those who need hope today. The final image glows, a desert horizon golden and endless, and a single line appears. The God who multiplies still does.